Welcome all to our final installment of the materials seminar series for fall. Again, we're going to have a full roster in spring, but today we have saved our talk for the best. So we have Dr. Stephen Cluff from Army Research Labs who's going to give a talk today on characterization and modeling of AF 9628 steel via laser powder bed fusion. Just a few brief words on Stephen. Stephen works at Army Research Labs in the additive manufacturing group of the Manufacturing Science and Technology branch at ARL. He received his PhD in mechanical engineering from BYU and focuses on, and his work, at least in BYU, focused heavily on mesoscale modeling, utilizing kinetic Monte Carlo and FEM. And I'm sure that if he's keeping track of football, college football, BYU is doing really well this year, right?
It is, which during my history at BYU, that hasn't always been the case. So it's been kind of exciting.
Okay, so with that, the floor is yours, Stephen.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction. Let me just go ahead and share my screen. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you all are at the moment. My name is Stephen Cluff. I guess I was given a wonderful introduction already. Just to kind of rehash that real quick, I'm a postdoctorate researcher here at Army Research Lab. I'm working as a material engineer with the Manufacturing Science and Technology branch, kind of working my way in as a modeling lead. To give a few more introductory details, as was said, I finished my PhD in mechanical engineering at Brigham Young University this past December 2019. While I was there, I focused on the characterization and modeling of steels, specifically modeling the kinetics of the mechanically induced Martensite transformation. But today, I'm going to share some of the characterization and modeling efforts that are going on here at Army Research Lab that are focused on a novel high-strength steel that is designated AF 9628. My primary focus will be on the characterization of the steel using a process called prior austenite reconstruction, after which I'll briefly introduce the material, AF 9628. I'll describe how prior austenite reconstruction works. I'll show some of the results that I've gotten for samples that were cast, wrought, and then some that were formed via laser powder bed fusion. After that, I'll spend a small amount of time describing our modeling interests with regard to AF 9628. And with that, I will go ahead and get started. So the top image here is likely familiar to many of you, if not all of you. The material science tetrahedron, as it's called, is a representation of how each of the various approaches to studying a material connect to one another. No one part of the tetrahedron is completely separate from the others, and all of them are interrelated. The middle node, labeled characterization, represents our means of studying how each node of the tetrahedron affects others. Often this node also includes the additional label of modeling, as the simulation of the various connections between these nodes provide valuable insight into how the given material behaves. The image below the tetrahedron depicts a complex process that some of you are already familiar with called laser powder bed fusion. It's the process through which a laser sinters or fully melts layers of fine metallic powder to build up a metallic part. This process involves many different complex physical phenomena, from the melting and solidification of metal powder to the interaction between laser and metal, to the physics of heat transfer, the formation of residual stresses, and other phenomena. Each of these complex phenomena play large roles in the ultimate performance of parts made via the laser powder bed fusion method. This technology is relatively new compared to other manufacturing techniques. It's been gaining increased popularity as manufacturers look for flexible and cost-effective ways to manufacture parts. Laser powder bed fusion offers rapid manufacturing of parts with excellent mechanical properties that require a minimum of post-process machining. Add to that the fact that it can be done in a fraction of the floor space required from traditional machining methods, and you have a very attractive manufacturing option. Because of the complexity of the process, though, there are still yet many challenges to be overcome. Residual stresses, porosity, control of aspects of microstructure, and other challenges are all at the forefront of research on laser powder bed fusion. But these challenges, though challenging, these modeling efforts are also very exciting. And in that context, I'd like to describe a bit of what the Army's motivations are for looking at AF 9628 as a material. So at the Army Research Lab, we have a number of essential research programs. One such program is described on the left. It's called the Sciences of Additive Manufacturing for Next Generation Munitions. The Army is interested in utilizing additively manufactured components to improve the function of munitions parts while also controlling how these parts behave in high strain rate deformation modes. Our goal is to control how parts fragment by controlling their underlying microstructures. Additive manufacturing methods are unique in their ability to control local temperature. And so by controlling the powder bed fusion process parameters, it's possible that you can make parts with heterogeneously distributed properties. This idea is referred to as heterogeneous design. Specifically with regard to AF 9628, our current efforts can be considered a cross-section of the material science tetrahedron, kind of represented here at the bottom right. Characterization efforts provide data that serves to validate predictive process to structure models as well as structure to property models. Microstructural modeling can in turn plug in to property modeling as well to provide a larger design loop. Ultimately, the goal is to explore the mapping of process to properties through structure as an intermediary. So for those that aren't as familiar with steel, many of you will be, but by rapidly cooling face-centered cubic austenite, which is kind of the high temperature phase of steel, the material can transform into bodied-centered cubic or bodied-centered tetragonal martensite. And this happens through a non-diffusive transformation mechanism that we have labeled just the martensite transformation. Face-centered cubic austenite grains essentially shatter into a collection of martensite laths. This is kind of depicted in the images on the right, where on the top you have the austenite grain structure, and then beneath it you have the resulting lath martensitic structure. Looking at the martensite lath structure in the bottom, your eye might be drawn to where this inverse pole figure mapping, where the coloring shifts. Often, but not always, these color shifts correspond with the boundaries between the pre-existing austenite grains, which you can, in this image, confirm by looking at the top image there. But again, that rapid transformation is called the martensite transformation. Here, so now I'd like to introduce AF 9628 as a material. This EBSD map that you see in the top shows the martensitic lath structure, the lath martensitic structure of AF 9628 as cast. AF 9628 is a high strength, low alloy martensitic steel. Let's see, the morphology of the martensite lath and grain boundary structures in this material is what drives, and with other materials, is what drives the mechanical properties. You can make out in this material many of the prior austenite boundaries visually. One common result of the martensite transformation in some steels is that the austenite grain boundary structures are often very well preserved. Within a region of a prior austenite grain, the martensite laths are grouped into packets of laths that have the same habit plane of formation. Within a packet, you have blocks of similarly oriented laths. A depiction of these different structures is shown there at the bottom right. Ultimately, the strength of this material is derived from the distribution of those different boundary types, the boundaries between laths, blocks, packets, and even prior austenite boundaries. And so characterizing and differentiating those boundaries is an important thing to do in martensitic steels and in this material in particular. So to characterize the material as a function of processing, one useful computational technique that I'll introduce now is prior austenite reconstruction. This is a computational method of grouping those martensite laths back into their parent austenite grain structures. An example of this is given right here on this slide. So on the left, you have a subsection of the data set that was shown on the previous slide. On the right, you have the martensite laths that have been grouped into their parent austenite grains. The orientation of the parent austenite grain has also been back calculated, which that orientation alone provides a wealth of information about the microstructure. You can observe the morphology, size, and texture of the austenite grains. Knowing the parent austenite grain that each martensite grain came from allows you to identify those packet and block boundaries that I mentioned previously. Finally, you can quantify variant selection behaviors. And so as a result of the nature of the Martensite transformation, there's actually a discrete number of Martensite orientations that typically form when a single austenite grain transforms. These possible orientations are referred to as variants. As many as 24 of them can form from a single austenite grain, but not all 24 of them will form necessarily. The preferred formation of a subset of those 24 variants is called variant selection. And understanding variant selection is important because it has an important effect on the texture of the final Martensite microstructure. Prior austenite reconstruction is a useful tool to have when trying to link final microstructure and properties to the process. In laser powder bed fusion, the austenite structure is an intermediate stage because austenite is typically only stable at high temperatures. And so it can't be imaged in situ. You can't directly observe the austenite microstructure. So having a computational tool that allows you to reconstruct it gives you the power to observe the austenite, and it gives you the ability to learn more about the material through the time frame in which it's processed. Our goal here is to utilize prior austenite reconstruction to identify how grain boundary structures are affected by processing. After briefly describing how prior austenite reconstruction works, I'll then show you some of the results of reconstructions performed on various samples of AF9628 cast, wrought, and additively manufactured by laser powder bed fusion. And if you give me just a moment, I'll take a sip of some water here. Okay, in the following slide, so the prior austenite reconstruction method relies on an orientation relationship between the parent austenite grains and the daughter Martensite variants that form. Because the Martensite transformation is non-diffusive, the transformation happens as a localized mechanical deformation. And it's that mechanical nature of this transformation that results in a specific set of Martensite lath orientations that can be formed from a single austenite grain. So earlier I defined those as variants. There's 24 possible depending on which steel you're looking at. And those variants form with specific orientations that are typically possible. Those orientations are shown for a given orientation relationship called the Kurgimov-Sachs orientation relationship in this pole figure here. If you're not familiar with pole figures, what this image depicts is essentially the XYZ axes of little cubes that denote the orientation of local crystal structure. So for every single orientation, you have 3 points. And what you're essentially looking at is, imagine you're looking at the top of a dome where those XYZ axes are extending out from the origin and intersect the surface of that dome. And then where you see that point is a representation of that. And so that can be kind of counterintuitive to look at, but if you're familiar with pole figures, you'll recognize here that there are 24 different orientations with 3 100 poles each. And you'll notice that the configuration that these poles take is that of, I call them circles and bars. These circles and bars is kind of typical of the Kurgimov-Sachs orientation relationship. Let's see. This set of orientations, being the set of Martensite crystal orientations that can form from a single austenite crystal, are the circles of the circles and bars are centered around the 100 poles of the parent austenite orientation. So in this pole figure, the austenite grain that formed these theoretical 24 variants is unrotated from the frame of the pole figure. Beneath the pole figure, there's a table that defines a few other orientation relationships, which again depend on the type of steel being studied. This table lists a few possible orientation relationships and depicts them as the set of equivalent crystallographic planes and directions between the parent and daughter structures. For AF9628, the Kurgimov-Sachs orientation relationship holds best, which is often true for lath martensitic steels. Just to kind of demonstrate this directly with actual martensite orientations, if you take from the left image, which is the same set of EBSD data shown earlier. The region of pink and green laths in the top left have been collected and their orientations have been plotted in the pole figure on the right. You can see the same circle and bars type configuration that's typical of the Kirchhoff-Sachs orientation relationship. Again, the orientation of the austenite grain that would belong to that region would be defined by the 100 poles that would lie right at the center of those three circles. Note that the martensite orientations are not perfectly aligned with the theoretically defined variance in the previous pole figure. There are many sources of deviation from the formation of perfect variance, so the choice of orientation relationship is often made to minimize that error. So the reconstruction algorithm, which I'll describe briefly, what it has at its core is a neighbor-to-neighbor comparison of martensite grains or laths. The schematic at the bottom kind of depicts this in a concentrated form. The left side of the schematic depicts a 2D spatial region of the scan, where you have two groups of martensite grains that are divided by a prior austenite boundary that we have yet to discover. The Kirchhoff-Sachs orientation relationship, while it defines the set of martensite orientations that you can get from a single austenite grain, the inverse of that relationship defines the set of possible parent orientations that could have given you a single martensite grains orientation. So using the inverse orientation relationship, which is kind of depicted in this short formula right here, you can generate all of the possible parents for individual martensite grains and then compare those possible parents to each other. The right part of the schematic is a 2D depiction of the space of orientations. So right now it's showing the possible parents for each of the martensite grains on the left. All of the possible parents for the neighboring martensite grains, let's see, they've been generated using the inverse of the orientation relationship. Some of these parents are very close to each other, which you'll notice. The dotted line there indicates some notion of tolerance. If a group of possible parent orientations are within some misorientation tolerance of each other, then those three martensite grains you would say could be grouped together, and the parent austenite orientation that you would assign to that group of martensite grains would be the average of these overlapping orientations in orientation space. And so essentially you would compare neighbors to neighbors. So now moving on to actual reconstructions of AF 9628. I'll present results for a few different samples of this material. To start, this EBSD data set for the cast AF 9628 sample shown on the top is the complete data set from some of the images shown earlier. Below it, the reconstructed parent austenite grains are shown. The algorithm used to perform the reconstruction automatically uses a cluster growth type algorithm to find viable groupings of martensite grains. Once a suitable set of 3 martensite grains are found to have a common possible parent, such as in the schematic shown in the previous slide, their neighbors are then checked iteratively to find neighbors to that cluster that have possible parents that are also within tolerance. The parent austenite grain is then defined once the cluster can no longer continue growing. Often there are regions where those clusters overlap each other and you have to further subdivide those two clusters. This is often caused in the presence of twinning within the parent austenite structure. A few twins are shown in this slide here that have been identified. The method to perform this cleanup has also been automated, and so this prior austenite reconstruction has been automated entirely. So now for some of the useful data that we can get from these reconstructions. So again, looking at the subset of the cast AF 9628 sample, the original IPF map on the left with the reconstructed prior austenite grains shown in the middle. On the right is a depiction of the differentiation between prior austenite boundaries in red and packet boundaries in black. The distinction of these boundaries is an important one since packet boundary misorientations are restricted to a possible set of misorientations due to the discrete number of martensite variants that can form from a single austenite grain. The set of austenite boundaries, however, those misorientations are a function of the austenite texture. This boundary map illustrates the relationship between austenite texture, grain size, and final martensitic grain boundary structures. And this information is invaluable to the modeling of the plastic behavior in this material, since it's the grain boundary structures that greatly define strength and hardening behaviors. Take another sip of water real quick. So some prior austenite reconstructions are harder than others, depending on the processing of martensitic steels being studied. Here, a sample of wrought and heat-treated AF9628 is shown with the heat treatment shown on the right. This sample was austenitized and quenched, showing a clean martensitic structure in the top image. The reconstructed austenite grains are shown in the bottom image, exhibiting some twinning, such as the grain, for example, at the very top right of that reconstructed image. This sample can be compared to the next sample on the next slide, which is a bit different. So here, a similarly wrought and heat-treated sample of AF9628 has been reconstructed, or rather, the reconstruction was attempted. This sample has a lower austenitization temperature and was likely not completely re-austenitized. This is evidenced by the large reconstructed austenite regions with very irregular boundaries, and then smaller austenite regions within those regions with more regular boundaries, kind of embedded in the larger austenite reconstructed regions. Now for some additively manufactured samples. So this slide depicts reconstruction results for AF9628 formed via laser powder bed fusion. The martensitic structure is depicted by EBSD in the top left image. The reconstructed austenite grains are shown in the top right, and immediately apparent is the typically vertical alignment of the austenite grains with respect to the build direction, which is defined by the arrow on the right. The austenite grains are clearly undergoing the same type of epitaxial growth that's shown by other materials formed by laser powder bed fusion. Since the martensite transformation is caused by rapid cooling, it's not yet directly known if this form of epitaxial growth happens due to the persistence of austenite grains from layer to layer, or if reheating as the laser passes over previously centered regions, if that reheating causes the reverse transformation of martensite back into the same austenite grain orientations as before, which would provide the orientation preference for the newly solidified material. Either way, the directional anisotropy of the austenite grain boundaries is immediately apparent, as shown in the bottom left image. The messy packet boundary structure shown in the bottom right is shown as well. The packet boundaries are a bit more equiaxed than the parent austenite structures, which is a little thing of note. It's possible that the anisotropic arrangement of parent austenite boundaries would introduce some form of anisotropy in the plastic behavior of this material. If so, that would be an interesting and viable means to manipulate the mechanical behavior of the part through laser powder bed fusion. Okay. So this slide depicts the reconstructions performed for a few other samples of AF9628. All of them formed via laser powder bed fusion. These were processed using slightly different build parameters, so differing in terms of laser power and scan speed. A more statistically significant data set would need to be gathered, of course, to compare these samples to processing. But even here, you can see a small difference in the austenite grain size between them. The same epitaxial growth of austenite is observed with respect to the build direction, but the width of austenite grains within the cutting plane here seems to differ. The morphology of these austenite grains may not be equiaxed in the build plane either, though, and so that is an observation that still needs to be made. Ultimately, though, a lot of future work will need to be performed to correlate these structures all the way back to process parameters. Prior austenite reconstruction, however, will provide a useful useful set of data as work continues on to the mechanical testing and the development of plasticity models for AF9628. So now, having shown some results, I would like to just change gears for a bit and talk very briefly about the current modeling interests and efforts that we're pursuing here at ARL with regards to AF9628. First, I'll take another sip of water. So displayed here is a digital workflow that kind of maps out the processes that are or can be part of a simulation of the laser powder bed fusion process. And there's a lot here. The workflow encompasses many different processes from storage and management of database information to pre-processing a simulation, and all the way through to the simulations themselves and post-processing. The input data includes part information, FEA models, material property information, the details of the machine being used to manufacture the part, such as laser power, scan speed, build plate dimensions, the build chamber dimensions, so on and so forth. The digital pre-processing steps shown here often echo the steps required to set up the actual physical build, such as defining the scan strategy, setting up the build plate with the distribution of parts being built, defining supports under the part, and optimizing the orientation of the part as it's printed. The simulations themselves can be broken up into three kind of interrelated categories, starting with thermal simulation. Here, the transient temperature is calculated throughout the solid part, the build plate as well, and even the inside of the simulated build chamber, all as a function of time. In an FEA simulation, for example, finite elements that are part of the part model are activated as the laser passes over them, and those elements then contribute to the thermal solution of the model. Coupled to this thermal solution is the mechanical solution, which takes those temperatures as an input and calculates the stresses and strains that are caused by the severe thermal gradients that are often present in laser powder bed fusion and other additive manufacturing methods. The goal of mechanical simulations is to calculate those residual stresses because they are an ever-present challenge in various forms of additive manufacturing, causing things like the collision of the powder blade recoater with the part because it's too warped, or a failure to actually reach the tolerances required of the manufactured part. The third simulation type listed here is the simulation of microstructure as a function of the thermal processing. And sometimes that'll also include aspects of the mechanical solution when stress is a driver for mechanical or for microstructural change. Here, the thermal history of a single material point can be used in conjunction with various other algorithms to simulate aspects of microstructure. Microstructural quantities of particular interest for AF9628 include porosity, phase content, prior austenite grain size, and others. And then on the right side, you can see just the types of output information that you get from these simulations. You can simulate the final net shape of the part. You can, again, detect failure events like blade crash events. You calculate residual stresses. And then you can also get microstructural information, as I listed before, porosity, phase content, and the like. So let's see if this video will play here. Oh, no luck. Oh, that's because I transported it to a PDF. That was silly of me. This video was meant to depict just kind of a very fast simulation of the thermal simulation, a fast thermal simulation of just a general test coupon, showing the distribution of temperatures during the build as well as finally at the end of the build. So I'm sorry I don't have that here, but an overarching goal here is to simulate the aspects of microstructure that have a direct impact on the fracture behavior of AF9628. Components made from AF9628 as manufactured by laser powder bed fusion. The two, as I listed before, the two main microstructural features of interest and that are highlighted here are porosity and phase content, specifically the amount of retained austenite within the steel structure. So microstructural simulations depend on the knowledge of the thermal history of each region of the part as a function of time. The thermal history is used in conjunction with various types of thermodynamic modeling of phase transformation at different length scales. This modeling can take various forms, from empirically defined functions to phase field modeling to CalFAD and other types of modeling. The key input to any microstructural model, however, is a detailed and accurate representation of the part's thermal history throughout its entire volume. So on the next slide, this depicts a study that was performed at Texas A&M on the formation of porosity in AF9628. For those familiar with laser powder bed fusion, the various modes of forming porosity will be very familiar already. Keyholing porosity is when the laser power is high and the speed is low, so that regions of material absorb too much energy from the laser and that material essentially vaporizes. and that leaves behind pores. If the if the laser is too weak, or if it's moving too quickly, not enough energy will be deposited into the material and it will not fully melt or will only partially sinter. Balling is another melt pool phenomenon that occurs from a combination of high laser power and speed. Each of these are normally purposefully avoided due to the detrimental effects that porosity has on final part performance. But since with our essential research essential research project that we're focused on, since an aspect of that is trying to control fragmentation patterns, having a good and detailed map of how to form various types of porosity could be useful for controlling fragmentation behaviors kind of on a mesoscale or on a part scale. This work by Texas A&M shows us this detailed mapping that we would need for two of the processing parameters, scan speed and laser power. This is an example of an important mapping that we would include in a design loop in which porosity formation is modeled. Next, this experimental data was gathered for an AF9628 sample via X-ray diffraction. This data shows a significant proportion of retained austenite in the material, which is austenite that never transforms to martensite but remains stable at room temperature. In this case, 15% roughly by volume of the material remained as austenite and didn't transform into martensite. The texture of both the martensite and austenite constituents in this sample are shown by the pole figures above. Retained austenite in this form often can be transformed when the material is deformed. So this affects the hardening behavior of the material as the transforming austenite regions contribute to local plasticity. This is known as transformation-induced plasticity, or TRIP for short. The phase content of AF9628 is another quantity that can be controlled by a manufacturing process. As the transformation of retained austenite has an effect on the final material's properties, this then is also an avenue through which we can control mechanical properties with processing parameters. Current efforts to model the formation of retained austenite will serve to map out the space of austenite content as a function of powder bed fusion parameters. Just another quick sip. So to incorporate the effects of transformation-induced plasticity, we are working with one of our academic partners at UNH to develop a crystal plasticity code for use with AF9628 that was previously applied to stainless steels. You could call AF9628 a trip-assisted steel because it has some small portion of the material that is retained as austenite. Whereas an austenitic stainless steel, for example, would be a full trip steel. On the left, I've shown an example phase map for a different steel, but it's a trip-assisted steel with a similar proportion of retained austenite. On the right are some of the experimentally measured and simulated plastic responses of an austenitic stainless steel using the model developed at UNH. The hardening behavior in this material is very heavily influenced by the formation of martensite as the deformation causes austenite to transform. And we suspect that AF9628 will be similarly affected by the transformation of its retained austenite. Let's see. So the current collaborative efforts that we're engaged in right now is to combine this crystal plasticity model with the knowledge of underlying microstructure in AF9628. This will provide a model capable of simulated AF9628 plasticity in detail, utilizing the results of prior austenite reconstruction. This model, if sufficiently predictive, will provide a means to map from the material structure space into the property space and part behavior space. Shown here is just kind of a very basic schematic of the mapping from microstructure to geometry to part behavior. It's important to note here that there's an intermediate effect of geometry in the mapping from structure to part behavior. The laser powder bed fusion process is very sensitive to geometry due to the effect that geometry has on cooling. And so optimizing the shape and orientation of the part being printed is also an essential part of the design process for additively manufactured parts. So ultimately, our goal is to close the design loop by having the capability to model everything, starting from process mapping to final parts behavior. The highly localized effects of laser powder bed fusion potentially allow for the control of microstructural features through the geometry of the part to a degree, essentially enabling the creation of functionally graded materials, or if not a functionally graded material, just a functionally graded microstructure throughout the volume of a part, giving us a custom part behavior as a function of our optimized goals, our success function. It's useful to note here that geometry is also a variable to be optimized on kind of as an inner optimization loop all the way back to process because of the effect that geometry has on cooling. But ultimately, the goal, the long-term efforts in developing these modeling tools will be to engage in this optimization to achieve tailored fragmentation patterns, as well as kind of tailored plastic behavior as a function of position through the part. Just in summary then, I'll just kind of go over our points real quick. So I focused the majority of my time today on prior austenite reconstruction, demonstrating the type of information it can provide, the worth it has for future mechanical modeling, and I also showed some of the reconstruction results for AF9628 that was formed through different manufacturing processes. I also showed some of the unique features that prior austenite, some unique features of prior austenite in AF9628 that was formed by laser powder bed fusion. Current and future microstructural modeling efforts centered on AF9628 here at ARL will seek to create this mapping from the space of process variables to microstructural features. And this is supported by work internal to ARL as well as work in collaboration with our research partners. Finally, the long-term goal with modeling of AF9628 is to fully map from the laser powder bed fusion process all the way to final part geometry and mechanical behavior, providing a design loop to plan out parts with heterogeneous microstructural features. And with that, that's all I have for you today. And I am happy to take some questions.
Thanks a lot, Stephen. That was a great talk. Very informative. I think very beneficial, at least for me and a few others. Folks, if you have questions, please post it on the group chat and we can ask the questions one by one. I know that I have some questions, but Ankit, I think it's your turn now. You're the
Sure.
first one.
Yeah, I can go first. So really nice talk, Stephen. So if the cooling rate is lower than the quench, so we are not really quenching, like not just throwing it into a bucket of water, but essentially just maybe air, furnace cooling or something like that. The process microstructure may comprise of phases like light as well, in addition to the modern stuff.
Yes,
So in the prior austenite reconstruction algorithm that you discussed today, distinguish between the lamellar and the lat-like microstructures, and what if like a plate-like microstructure forms, say, for example, in a high carbon steel, unlike in low carbon where you see lat-like?
Yes, good question. So there are several things that would make a reconstruction difficult in the case of longer cooling times where you might have polygonal ferrite or something. Because that transformation mechanism is mostly diffusive, you kind of lose the orientation relationship, and polygonal ferrite grains will essentially consume and erase the prior austenite grain boundaries. And so there's kind of a boundary. It gets progressively more and more difficult to perform reconstructions on steels that have longer cooling times, where more kind of thermodynamically stable phases are forming. That's also true of carbides, because carbides don't necessarily form the same type of orientation relationships with the parent austenite structures. In terms of the plate microstructures that you get in high temperature steels, it depends on your resolution. If you're able to resolve, so that the plate martensite structures are, of course, the very finely twinned coupling of two martensite variants that twin back to back with each other to maintain that undeformed habit plane between the martensite and the austenite. And those variants, if they were large enough, you would be able to correlate them back to the parent austenite orientation. But since they're so fine, you're unlikely to be able to resolve those orientations unless you'd probably have to rely on TEM or something that would get you a much higher resolution. If you have that information, then yes, you can perform the reconstruction. But for steels, in the examples that I have here, looking at those kind of resolutions, it's not likely you'd be able to distinguish individual variants of martensite from the actual plates themselves.
So the other question that I had was about, again, the algorithm. So how do you validate it? I would say maybe go back and link it up with the original pre heat treated microstructure of austenite, the homogenized structure. And then do you have any plans of like extending this work into also like doing a mapping of the 3D microstructure?
Yes. So your first question, validation. So yes, this effect or this technique can be validated in some restricted ways. If you have a scanning electron microscope with the capability for in situ heating, you can heat your sample up into the austenite temperature region, and you can actually get some EBSD information of the austenite structure, and then you can quench it if that capability is there. Or if the steel is hardenable enough, if you have enough airflow to quench it to martensite, then that would be a good validation set. Other validation you can get if there is some small amount of retained austenite that gives you a little set of kind of flag post validation, just to see if your back calculation, if the orientations you're getting match the orientations of the retained austenite. Some samples of steel have enough retained austenite that if you look at just retained austenite, you can almost trace out the boundaries of the parent austenite as well. And so that provides a good way to validate it. But what the tool is ultimately used for is for steels where you can't image the processing in situ. So once the process has been validated, you can apply it to steels that underwent very complex processing, whether it's hot rolling, some other form of wrought steel processing, or whether it's something like laser powder bed fusion, where there's really no chance for you to capture the austenite microstructure kind of in that window. So your second question, remind me, what was it was about?
The 3D microstructure.
Yes. Yes, definitely. That's definitely a valuable way to look at kind of 3D distributions of variant selection. There are people that perform prior austenite reconstructions and have engaged in 3D reconstructions of those microstructures to look at things like plasticity during various forms of austenite processing and things. And so yes, that's a very useful thing to do. That's not on our list explicitly for something to do with AF 9628, but we very well may end up going down that road as we're building mesoscale models of AF 9628 microstructures.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Anyone?
I think we have a question from Fezzi.
Yeah, go ahead.
Fezzi, yeah, sorry.
Fazil, can you unmute yourself and ask Dr. Cluff the question?
Hi, Dr. Pratt.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I am wondering, like, the planning for crystal plasticity model, like mapping the microstructures. So I was thinking, like, is that any advantage, like, instead of building like statistical RVE and doing the modeling on that?
So kind of instead of engaging in full part scale crystal plasticity modeling, you're asking if we have any interest in doing some mesoscale modeling. Is that
yeah,
correct?
Like multi-scale modeling, yeah.
Multi-scale modeling using RVEs and such. The answer is yes. We're planning on doing essentially all of the above. An RVE model will probably be a first step towards validating a crystal plasticity model that's trying to incorporate a lot of different microstructural features into one. We'll essentially take a material point that we know the thermal history, where we know its thermal history. We may either assign it some microstructural features in terms of austenite, like the quantity of retained austenite boundaries, or prior austenite boundaries, packet boundaries, and lath boundaries, and then maybe even incorporate some retained austenite, and then we'll kind of characterize the material's plastic behavior on a mesoscale first before we engage in full part scale modeling.
Cool. Anyone else? Stephen, I mean, Faisal already asked the question, but on a related note, in your plasticity models, do you explicitly account for the kind of interfaces you have, or is it swept under the carpet?
The idea is to incorporate different types of grain boundary structures underlying. The model that I showed as developed by Marko Nesvik at UNH, it's a elastoplastic self-consistent model, and he's used these models in lots of different ways. In this example, it's used to include aspects of the austenite, the mechanically induced martensite transformation in retained austenite. He also has other implementations of this model that include aspects of grain boundary content, and we're hoping to essentially attempt to merge some simple aspects of these two models together to give us a more detailed model of AF9628.
Okay, sounds great. Just wanted, hopefully Andrew, is Andrew still logged in? Yeah, so just wanted you to introduce you to Andrew. I think he teaches a class at 12. Hey, Andrew.
Hey, how are you, Krishna?
Stephen, do you know Andrew by any chance?
I have not met him personally, but it's nice to meet you here.
Hi, nice to meet you. I enjoyed the talk.
Thank you.
Andrew's he's leading the additive metal stuff at the University of Arizona.
Wonderful.
So, even though he's a University of Utah grad, so he may not like you too much. Right, Andrew?
I actually have some friends at Brigham Young, so I've not let it deaden my sense of humor, I guess. But
yeah, I saw some presentations from the University of Utah at an America Makes summit, a laser powder bed fusion modeling summit, and I was very impressed with some of the stuff going on there. I've actually had a little bit of interest in reaching out to them to see what I can learn, see what I can learn about what they're doing.
Yeah, if you'd like some help with that, then I'm happy to do so. I know there's still a number of people there in their department. Actually, I recently come about a year ago from GE Additive.
Okay.
And, when I was working for GE, I was actually working with a few of the faculty members there at Brigham Young as well. And one of them, we were working mostly on welding stuff, but one of them has also bought a laser powder bed fusion machine there and has some.
Gotcha. That must have been Tracy Nelson by chance?
Yeah, so I was working with Tracy Nelson a lot, and then Mike Miles is pretty good.
Of course. Yeah, both of them were on my committee.
Yeah, great guys.
Wonderful guys, yeah.
Cool. So sorry, didn't mean to put you on the spot, Andrew. I know that you have a class now, so I just wanted to make sure you said hi.
I was trying to. I was happy to meet, and I saw that he was from Brigham Young, so somewhat shared geography there. So I'm glad to have a chance to at least introduce myself now.
Yeah, it's nice to meet you. I'll have to reach out sometime. I'd love to hear more about what you do.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Any other questions, folks? We have 10 more minutes. So Stephen, have you looked into this new method called peridynamics? Do you know of it?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I don't think I am familiar.
Peridynamics. Peridynamics.
Ah, peridynamics. Okay. No, I'm not as familiar with that.
It's actually pretty. It's like a very. I mean, that community would hate if I say this, but it's almost like a coarse-grained molecular dynamics, and you can explicitly incorporate lots of interfacial information in it.
Interesting.
That's like face field.
yeah. But peridynamics, I mean, it is you're solving for the equations of motion. So in that sense, it's MD.
So it's more like a front tracking. So they track the. Okay. Yeah.
But I think something like a phase field combined with peridynamics would be a nice alternate to what the microstructure crystal plasticity models that you're doing. But that's a conversation we can have later. I mean,
yeah, definitely. I would be interested to hear more about that. And we're kind of in a stage right now where we're acquiring software to kind of build this framework. And so I'm considering a number of different things. For for kind of chemical and thermodynamic modeling, we have access to thermocalc.
Yeah.
When it comes to FEA, I live typically in Abacus. That's where I work. But I've had some increasing interest in MOOS because of its kind of multi-physics capability. And it's because there's so many physical processes to simulate with laser powder bed fusion that it's kind of hard to kind of get everything in that you want to.
Absolutely.
But and also MOOS does phase field too. But this peridynamics sounds very interesting as well.
Yeah, but just FYI, Ankit is the phase field guru.
Okay, I'll take his advice on things.
Yeah.
I'm new to phase field and I'm new to kind of this area as well, and so I'm looking to meet some good and well-informed people.
I really like your talk in the sense that I love the topic of steel because that was my dissertation research. So it's hard to get any funding on steel these days, but whenever I get a talk to
Yeah,
make sure that I on that because it's a topic very close to my heart. So.
Mine as well. It was maybe not as close to my heart because I was so steeped in it. I was like, oh, I'm starting to hate steel. But now that I'm out of it, out of grad school, it's like, that wasn't so bad. I kind of like studying steel.
But this was great, Stephen. It was very informative for us, I think.
Thank you.
And I think personally, I think Ankit and I would really like to reach out to you and explore, how we could.
I would love that. Yep. I'm looking to form connections. And so that would be wonderful.
Yeah. Andrew, you have a class today, right? Or you're done for the week or the
metal additive manufacturing starts in about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And you guys are sort of making me look bad because I basically told the whole class that if you should make something out of steel, you probably should, right? It's now you guys are trashing it.
Hopefully people in the steel community don't hate me because
I know that Don Godfrey was online, but I think he logged off. Otherwise,
he also logged in today. I saw him.
Yeah. So Don's he runs the additive at SLM, and he's a well-wisher of this talk. He in fact gave a seminar earlier in October. Cool, Stephen. We'll really look. It was a great talk. Thanks for your time. At some point, we're going to request your address. I think Elsa is online, and I promise that all the seminar speakers were going to get a polo that they were expected to wear before the talk. But
gotcha. Okay.
I know you had me rush the order, and here I still have all the T-shirts.
Sorry, Elsa.
You and Ankit were like, come on.
Yeah. We'll Ankit, we need to send an email to everyone asking them to send their addresses once again.
Sure. Yeah. I'll do that.
But yeah, let's stay in touch, Stephen. And so this was great. This was a great end to the seminar series for the fall. Once again, I'm hoping that you get the announcements. Otherwise, even for spring, we have an interesting set of talks. So it will be great if you can log in once in a while to listen.
Absolutely. I would love to.
We in fact have maybe a couple of other metallurgy talks, Ankit, like one from
You'll have Tony Rollett speak next spring.
Oh yeah, Tony Rollett speaking. Yeah. John Carpenter from Los Alamos is speaking. I think we have a few heavyweights that'll be speaking next semester. I completely forgot. That's true. Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. Thanks, Stephen. Say hi to Andel and Q and Brandon if you see them.
Well, yeah, not in person for a while yet, but I will definitely say hi once I talk to them online.
Yeah, and Ankit will forward once we upload it on the website. Ankit will send you a link in case.
Sure. Yeah, I'm gonna send a circulation email for that. Yeah.
Okay.
Wonderful.
And
all right, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen, and thanks all for staying. So I was surprised we actually had 51 people log in today. That was surprising just because the semester's done, right? And we still had people log in.
Probably, Krishna, we are having some people from outside because we posted.
Yeah. I think Ibrahim from Texas A&M logged in. We had few other folks log in. Yeah. Okay, great. Stephen, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, New Year.
You as well. Yeah.
And stay safe. And likewise. Everyone stay safe, guys. Things are skyrocketing even in Arizona now. So with that, let's call it a day. Thanks, Ankit.
Thank
And
you.
I will send you the link to the once it gets uploaded. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.